The familiar hum of the fluorescent lights and the low murmur of the gallery were the only sounds as Judge Judy Sheindlin took her seat. With a sharp, decisive motion, she adjusted the microphone in front of her, the small click echoing in the hushed courtroom. Her eyes, magnified by her trademark glasses, scanned the room with an intensity that could make a statue squirm. Today's case, a simple small claims dispute over a pair of damaged glasses, felt anything but simple under her scrutinizing gaze. "I'd like the gentlemen to come up and stand next to their moms." Judge Judy's voice cut through the air, clear and commanding, a tone that left no room for argument. Two women, one in a floral print dress, the other in a smart blouse and pants, gently nudged their sons forward. The boys, both looking far too small for the imposing room, shuffled toward the plaintiff and defendant podiums. The announcer had already introduced the case. Marty Glenn is suing the mother of her son's former schoolmate, Katherine Harrison, for the cost of damaged glasses. Judge Judy looked from one mother to the other, her expression unreadable. "Actually, their moms are not necessary parties for me, 'cause neither one of you were there in school when this incident happened." She paused, a pregnant silence hanging in the air, allowing her words to sink in. "Is that correct?" The two women, taken aback by their dismissal from the front lines of the case, responded almost in unison. "Correct," one said, the other nodding mutely. They looked relieved to step back, a palpable weight lifting from their shoulders as they retreated into the relative anonymity of the gallery, leaving their sons to face the formidable judge alone. The boys, now standing side by side, were a study in contrast. The taller boy, with a mop of sandy hair, fidgeted slightly, his hands clasped behind his back. The other, shorter and with dark cropped hair, stood perfectly still, his chin slightly raised. They seemed to be in their own private worlds, carefully avoiding each other's gaze. "What's your first name?" Judge Judy asked, her focus now entirely on the boys. "My first name is Parker," the taller boy answered, his voice barely a whisper. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "And yours?" "Jordan," the shorter boy replied, his voice a little more confident, though his eyes remained fixed on the wall behind the judge. "Now, Parker and Jordan used to be friends," Judge Judy stated, the "used to be" heavy with implication. The two boys glanced at each other for a fleeting second, a flicker of something unidentifiable passing between them before their eyes darted away again. They were 13 years old, at that awkward, in-between age where friendships could be as fragile as the glasses at the heart of the dispute. For a few months, Parker estimated it to be about 6 months, 4 months, their lives had been intertwined. It was a typical middle school friendship, forged in the crucible of shared classes, lunchtime conversations, and the fleeting camaraderie of school sports. Their bond, while short, had felt as real as any friendship could at that age. They had a shared history, a quiet understanding built on inside jokes, and a mutual love for whatever video game was popular at the time. They had probably spent countless hours together, discussing everything and nothing. In that way, only close friends can. But just as easily as it had begun, it had ended. One moment they were friends, and the next they were not. Their brief camaraderie had soured, likely over something trivial that, at the time, felt monumentally important. A perceived betrayal, a misspoken word, a shift in social circles. Such was the nature of middle school alliances. Today, their former friendship was a ghost in the courtroom, haunting the space between them as they stood just inches apart, strangers once more. The tension in the courtroom ratcheted up a notch. The silence was no longer a simple lack of sound. It was an active presence, a character in the drama. Judge Judy leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowed. The playful innocence of their past was in stark contrast to the serious atmosphere of the present. "And there was an incident in school when you guys were playing around," she said, her voice dropping a little, no longer a commanding bark, but a probing inquiry. "Mm-hmm," Parker mumbled, his eyes finally meeting the judge's for a moment before dropping to the floor. Now it was time for the facts. The judge turned her attention to the defendant. "Now, Jordan, I want you to tell me what happened on that day." All eyes were on Jordan now, the spotlight of justice, cold and unforgiving. He took a small breath, preparing to tell his side of a story that had already caused so much friction and pain. The case was no longer just about a pair of broken glasses. It was about a broken friendship, a moment of careless horseplay, and the fallout that followed, all playing out on the most public of stages. Judge Judy's voice was like a hammer blow, cutting through the thick, anxious air of the courtroom. Now, Jordan, I want you to tell me what happened on that day. The spotlight of her attention, cold and unblinking, was entirely on him. He took a small, shaky breath. In the world of the courtroom, the stern bailiff, the fidgeting parents, the imposing bench fell away. He was back on the playground. The sun was high in the sky, a warm weight on his shoulders as he sat on the very top of the bright yellow slide. The plastic was slick and hot beneath him, a familiar texture he'd known since kindergarten. The playground below was a riot of color and motion, a soundscape of yelling kids, the rhythmic squeak of swing chains, and the thumping of a soccer ball. He wasn't playing with anyone, just sitting with his back to the commotion, talking to his friend, a quiet moment in the middle of a boisterous PE-free period. They were talking about the last game they'd played on their consoles, the conversation a comfortable, easy flow. Then a sudden light patter on his back. A handful of wood chips, dark and splintered, rained down, some catching in the fabric of his shirt. He flinched and turned, a frown creasing his brow. There at the bottom of the slide stood Parker. He had a slight, lopsided smirk on his face, a look that Jordan didn't understand. Was it a joke? A challenge? He hadn't talked to Parker in days, not since their friendship had fizzled out. This felt less like a playful gesture and more like a statement, an unsettling kind of statement. Jordan's voice, now steady, brought him back to the courtroom. So I was sitting on top of the slide talking to my friend. It was during PE because we had free time, able to do whatever we wanted. So while I was talking to my friends, Parker came by and he picked up a handful of wood chips and then threw them at me. Judge Judy, always looking for the simple, unvarnished truth, interjected. Wood chips? Yes, Jordan affirmed, remembering the gritty feel of them. They were everywhere on the playground, a soft, shock-absorbing carpet that now seemed to hold a darker purpose. He could still feel the phantom sensation of their impact. Is that what's on the floor of the playground? The judge asked, her eyes narrowing as she mentally pictured the scene. Yes, and he threw them at me. I told him to stop. Jordan's voice held a quiet, simmering frustration. That was the most confusing part. He'd given Parker an out. A simple, firm stop was a clear boundary. It was a chance to turn an awkward moment into nothing. But Parker hadn't stopped. In fact, his smirk widened. He bent down, scooped up an even larger handful of the chips, and with a swift, purposeful motion, he flung them with more force than the first time. This time, they hit Jordan with a more aggressive thud. A few pieces of the dark wood landed directly in his short, dark hair. Jordan felt the blood rush to his face. It wasn't the pain, it was the sheer public humiliation of it. He could hear the laughter of the other kids playing nearby, their giggles like little darts aimed directly at his dignity. This wasn't a game. This was something else entirely. An uncomfortable silence had replaced the playground buzz. The casual bystanders had become a quiet, judging audience. The embarrassment was a hot, prickly sensation that crawled up his neck. He felt exposed, foolish, and targeted. He had to do something, not to escalate, but to end it. His heart thumping, he slid down the slide. It felt like an eternity, the final humiliating descent. When his feet hit the soft ground, he strode with a purpose he didn't feel toward Parker. He didn't yell, he didn't swear. He just stood in front of him, close enough to be heard, far enough to avoid a physical fight. Then he picked up another handful, threw them at me, and then I came down from the slide, walked up to him, told him to stop. Then came the part that still stung. Jordan was still standing there, hands at his sides, delivering his final quiet ultimatum, when Parker, with an almost theatrical nonchalance, reached out and snatched the baseball cap from Jordan's head. It was a simple, lightning-fast motion, but it was anything but simple. The hat, a worn blue cap with the logo of his favorite team, was his most treasured possession. He'd worn it every day since his birthday. It was a part of him, an extension of his identity, in a world where identity for a 13-year-old was still a fragile, evolving thing. It was his shield, his symbol, and Parker had just taken it. With the hat in his hand, Parker sauntered over to the large green trash can that sat beside the basketball court. He didn't hesitate. He took Jordan's hat, crumpled it into a small ball, and plunged it deep into the festering darkness of the bin, burying it under wet paper towels and discarded wrappers. The gesture was so casual, so completely devoid of emotion, that it was terrifying. It wasn't about the hat. It was about what the hat represented. Jordan stood there, frozen, watching his dignity disappear into the garbage. The laughter from the other kids had stopped completely. The silence was heavy and thick, punctuated only by the distant squeak of the swings. He could feel their stares, the uncomfortable, pitying glances. It was a shame he would never forget. Judge Judy looked at Parker, then back at Jordan, her eyes scrutinizing every detail, every facial tic, every shift in body language. "Were you saying anything to each other?" Jordan shook his head, the memory of his own voice, calm and firm, echoing in his mind. "No, all I did was tell him to stop." "You hadn't had any argument with him that day?" "No, just playing around." The judge's final question was a question Jordan still hadn't answered for himself. Was it just playing around? Was he overreacting? But deep down, he knew the truth. It wasn't. The wood chips were a nuisance, but burying the hat was an act of finality, a statement. It wasn't a game anymore. It was personal. It was a declaration that their friendship was not just over, but annihilated. The courtroom hung on Jordan's words, his recounting of the playground incident painting a clear, if one-sided picture. When he finished, the silence was heavy with a shared sense of injustice. Jordan, still standing at the podium, looked at Judge Judy with a mixture of defiance and quiet desperation. "Well, the first time he threw it, I thought he was messing around, and then he threw it again, and I started getting agitated, and then he buried my hat in the trash." The escalation was palpable, a chain reaction of a schoolyard prank gone wrong. Jordan's initial confusion had turned to a simmer of agitation, a feeling that was now bubbling to the surface in the formal setting of the courtroom. The judge's gaze shifted to Parker, her expression a blank slate of judgment. She was looking for a reaction, any flicker of emotion that would reveal the truth. Parker simply stood there, his hands clasped behind his back, his face a mask of practiced indifference. "Who else was around you?" Judge Judy asked Jordan, her question simple and direct, but carrying a deeper implication. She was moving beyond the two boys, looking for a wider context for witnesses. "A couple of my friends," Jordan answered, his eyes darting toward the gallery where his mother and a couple of other women sat. He remembered the moment with a fresh wave of embarrassment. He had been so alone, perched atop the slide, and then his friends had come to his aid. "Did your friends say anything to Parker?" the judge probed. "At first they laughed, and then they saw me go down there and they started to back me up and tell him to stop." The words were a quiet admission of his helplessness and a testament to the loyalty of his friends. Their initial laughter, a painful echo in his memory, had quickly transformed into a unified chorus of support. For a 13-year-old, this shift from amusement to solidarity was a victory. Judge Judy, however, was not interested in victories. She wanted the unvarnished, moment-by-moment truth. She raised her hand, a gesture that immediately commanded silence. "We're just going to stop you right there. Let's get to March 3rd. She was cutting through the emotional residue, the hurt feelings, the accusations. She was a surgeon of facts, and she was zeroing in on the cause of the injury. "He's on top of the slide. What's happening?" This was the pivotal moment, the turning point where the narrative would either fracture or hold. Judge Judy was no longer talking to Jordan. She was addressing Parker directly, her focus now on the boy at the heart of the case. Parker took a deep breath, his hands still clasped behind his back. He seemed to shrink a little under the weight of her gaze. "Okay, so what happened was I was messing around with him." He was barely able to get the words out before Judge Judy interrupted him. "Okay, now messing around means something. It means different things to different people." A wry smile touched the corners of her lips. To a grown-up, messing around means something different from what it means to a 13-year-old. A wave of laughter swept through the gallery, a collective release of tension. The adults in the room knew exactly what she meant. For a 13-year-old, messing around could be a simple, harmless game, or a cruel, calculated act of aggression. It was a fluid term, a way for children to categorize their actions without having to face the consequences. But for Judge Judy, there was no gray area. Actions had consequences, regardless of intent. The humor, however, was short-lived. Judge Judy's expression hardened. She was not a comedian, she was a judge, and she was holding the boys accountable for their actions. Her voice dropped, a low, intense rumble. I want you to tell me exactly what you did when Jordan was sitting on top of the slide. The courtroom was silent again, the laughter a distant memory. The boys, one a plaintiff, the other a defendant, stood under the relentless scrutiny of the judge, their playground chaos reduced to the cold, hard facts of the courtroom. The moment-by-moment breakdown of March 3rd was about to begin, and Judge Judy was going to make sure every single detail, no matter how small, was laid bare for all to see. The laughter from the gallery, sharp and brief, had faded, leaving behind the heavy silence of the courtroom. Judge Judy's face was a study in focus, her earlier wry smile gone, replaced by a laser-like intensity. She had cut through the boys' shared history, the he said, and now she was at the core of the matter. What happened on March 3rd? She was no longer speaking to Jordan. She had turned her full attention to Parker, the boy with the sandy hair and the fidgeting hands. The pressure was on. Parker took a deep breath. His mind raced back to that day on the playground, a memory that felt both a lifetime ago and as fresh as yesterday. He had been so sure of himself then, so confident that what he was doing was just a game. He opened his mouth, the words messing around a familiar crutch. Well, we were poking fun at each other. The phrase felt safe, a universal language of adolescent horseplay. Judge Judy was having none of it. Her voice was an abrupt, cutting command. How? Say, tell me. There was no room for generalizations here. She wanted the specifics, the raw details, the truth he was trying to gloss over. Parker's carefully constructed indifference began to crumble. He felt a bead of sweat form at his hairline. He couldn't just say messing around again. He had to tell her what he did. His words came out in a rush, a clumsy attempt to minimize the event. So I was throwing some wood chips at him, and then he was trying to make it sound insignificant, a simple act of throwing small pieces of wood. But Judge Judy, a master of the interruptive probe, stopped him cold. She was not interested in the and then. She was interested in the before. Her voice was low and dangerous. Okay, so you threw some wood chips at him while he was sitting on top of the slide, and then what did he do? The playground of March 3rd reconstructed itself in Parker's mind, a vivid, high-definition memory. Jordan was up on the slide, talking to some kid Parker didn't know. Parker had been walking by, feeling a familiar mix of boredom and irritation. He and Jordan hadn't been friends for a few weeks, their falling out a forgotten grudge over something stupid. Maybe a video game, maybe a group chat. The sight of Jordan laughing unbothered struck a nerve. It was a challenge, a dare, a call to action. Parker had simply wanted to get a reaction. To show him he was still there, still a factor, that he wasn't invisible. He bent down, scooped up a small handful of wood chips, and flicked them at Jordan. It was a moment of pure adolescent impulsiveness. But Jordan hadn't laughed. He had told him to stop. He had looked down at him with an expression that was flat and unamused. That was the point where the game should have ended. But the crowd was watching. A few kids had laughed. It was an audience, and Parker, without a word, bent down and scooped up a larger handful. He threw it harder this time. A statement. He felt the exhilaration of the power, the simple fact that he was controlling this interaction. He had made Jordan's carefree moment end. But Jordan, to Parker's surprise, hadn't stayed on the slide. He had slid down, his face a mask of quiet fury. He walked toward Parker, his movements deliberate and slow. Parker's heart had thrummed with a nervous energy. This was no longer just messing around. This was a confrontation. And then he came down the slide, and then he started throwing wood chips at me. Parker said, the memory still fresh. It felt like a fair exchange, an equal response. Jordan had come to his level, thrown the chips back. It was a game now, one with a clear back and forth. So he threw them back at you, and? Judge Judy pushed, her voice a relentless tide. She was peeling back the layers of the incident, exposing the raw nerve endings underneath. She knew there was more to the story. Parker squirmed, his gaze flitting to the wall behind the judge. He tried to think of what to say, what to leave out. And then, I, I was down. He stalled, his mind a sudden blank. The next part was harder to explain. He had to be quick, to make it sound like it was all part of the same playful game. Judge Judy didn't let him. She cut him off with a single sharp word that felt like a slap. Hat. The word hung in the air, a final incriminating piece of evidence. Parker felt his face flush. He had to admit to it. There was no hiding it now. He stammered, his voice losing its forced casualness. Oh, and then, so I took the hat off his head, and then I put it. He tried to make it sound like an afterthought, an insignificant detail. But Judge Judy was on him again, her words a rapid-fire interrogation. Okay, so you took the hat. Next thing, you reached over, took the hat off his head, and put it in the final word of his sentence was already on her lips. It was a verdict waiting to be spoken. The courtroom was silent, leaning in. Garbage, Parker finished, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. Garbage, Judge Judy affirmed, the word now a sentence, a definitive statement of fact. Yeah, Parker conceded, his shoulders slumping slightly. He had tried to hide the malice, to frame it as a joke, but in the sterile, factual language of the courtroom, it was just a cold act of cruelty. He remembered the look on Jordan's face as he had tossed the hat. The surprise, the humiliation, the sudden, raw hurt. It had been an ugly moment, and he had been the one who had made it happen. The tension in the courtroom was a physical weight, pressing down on him. He had thought that after that, the fight was over. He had walked away. He hadn't seen the broken glasses, hadn't known what had happened next. He had just wanted to get away from the playground, from the cold look on Jordan's face, from the judging eyes of the other kids. And then what happened? Judge Judy asked, her voice a relentless pursuit of the truth. Parker, suddenly feeling cornered and exposed, gestured vaguely to his left. He was no longer in the courtroom. He was back in that moment, in the aftermath of a cruel, thoughtless act. And then he started to get mad, so I walked away from the area. I walked out of the playground area into, like, the field, like the playground's over here and then the field's over there. He was trying to create distance, both in his memory and in his physical description, separating himself from the case and the confrontation. He was no longer a participant, but an observer, watching the scene from the safety of the field. The playground, with its slides and swings and wood chips, was a place of conflict and shame. The open field, a symbol of escape and freedom. But Judge Judy wasn't going to let him escape. She was going to make him face it. Every single humiliating, painful detail. The courtroom, a silent theater of tension, watched as Judge Judy's gaze bored into Parker. She wasn't just asking questions. She was building a case against him with his own words. Parker had tried to frame his actions as an innocent game, but the judge was meticulously stripping away the facade. She knew what messing around meant to a 13-year-old, and she wasn't impressed. When he started to get mad, she said, her voice dropping to a low, intense rumble, he started to get mad as you were putting his hat in the garbage. Parker's stammering yes was barely audible. He could feel the weight of his own actions pressing down on him. The playground, once a vibrant world of freedom, was now a scene of a crime, meticulously reconstructed under the judge's cold light. He could still see it in his mind's eye. Jordan, a figure of quiet fury standing before him, his anger a visible, trembling thing. He was saying to you, stop it. Judge Judy's question was a statement, a declaration of fact that she had already concluded. Parker hesitated. He tried to find a way around the truth. Well, I mean, he wasn't encouraging you to do it. Her tone left no room for argument. She was laying the facts on the table, and he had to pick them up. No, he got mad after I put the hat in the trash because I didn't see him start to get mad. Only after. Parker's words trailed off, a pathetic attempt to shift the timeline, to diminish his role. But Judge Judy was a master of the game. She knew that the act of putting the hat in the garbage was not a reaction. It was the final deliberate act of a bully. Well, you grabbed the hat off of his head, and what did you immediately do with it when you grabbed it off his head? She pressed, her voice a relentless pursuit of the truth. She was not just interested in the what. She was interested in the how, the pace, the deliberate intent behind his actions. Parker, sensing a glimmer of an escape route, remembered his next move, a moment of fleeting power that now felt like a desperate, foolish flight. Well, I ran around with it. Okay, so you grabbed it off his head, and then you ran around with it. For how many minutes? It was about just like 30 seconds or so. He was trying to minimize the moment, to make it sound like a quick, harmless tease, but in the silence of the courtroom, 30 seconds stretched into an eternity. It was 30 seconds of Jordan's humiliation, 30 seconds of his desperate chase, 30 seconds of the crowd's cruel amusement. It was 30 seconds of Parker feeling like the king of the playground. And he was chasing you around, trying to get his hat back. Yeah, and then you stuffed it in the garbage. Parker's face flushed. This was the moment of truth, the final act of cruelty that had sealed his fate. He had to defend himself, to make it sound less malicious. Well, I set it on top of the garbage. I didn't really stuff it. I just put it on top. A small technical distinction that meant nothing in the grand scheme of things. To Jordan, it was the same thing. His hat, a piece of his identity, was now a piece of trash. And then what happened? Judge Judy's voice was as cold as a knife blade. She was leading him to the final act of the drama, the act that had brought them all here. And then I came back, because I thought it was going to be time to go in soon. Parker's defense was pathetic. He had walked away from the scene of the crime, and now he was trying to justify his actions with a flimsy excuse. Okay, so you walked away after you put his hat in the garbage. Then you came back. The judge's words were a summary of his cowardice. He had done the deed and then tried to pretend it didn't happen. Then came the final, brutal moment of the playground drama. Jordan, having retrieved his hat, had been filled with a righteous, boiling rage. He had found Parker on the edge of the field, just as the boy was about to make his escape. The confrontation was brief, but it was filled with the fury of a boy who had been publicly shamed. Jordan's words were a torrent of hurt and anger, and Parker, still high on the adrenaline of his little victory, had shoved him. It was a quick, reflexive action, a last attempt to assert dominance, but it had sent Jordan stumbling, and he had fallen to the ground, his face contorting in shock and pain. The sickening crunch of his glasses breaking was the sound that had brought the game to its brutal end. Back in the courtroom, Judge Judy looked at Marty Glenn, the plaintiff, her eyes as hard as steel. So you want Mrs. Harrison to pay for the glasses? Yes, ma'am. Marty Glenn's voice was firm, resolute. She believed in justice and accountability. She believed that Parker's mother should pay for her son's actions. That's not happening. The words were a flat, final pronouncement. A wave of nervous laughter rippled through the gallery, a shock of recognition that Judy was about to deliver one of her signature rulings. They knew she was about to drop the hammer, and they were ready for the show. She looked directly at Marty Glenn, her voice a calm, authoritative command. Tell him to get a job and pay for his own glasses. Marty Glenn was stunned. She was not used to being on the receiving end of a Judge Judy ruling. Why would that be? That would be because he was the aggressor. The words were a clap of thunder, and the courtroom erupted in applause. It was a spontaneous, unified cheer of approval. They knew she was right. They had seen it happen 1,000 times. Children who thought they could get away with bullying, with cruel jokes, with messing around. Marty Glenn, however, was not convinced. But a hat is not permanent damage. Judge Judy looked at her as if she were a particularly slow child. Her voice was pure ice. Well, if somebody put my hat in the garbage, I would not put it on my head again. And he was the aggressor to begin with. He was the initial aggressor and kept it going, and he was a bully who got his comeuppance. You pay for his glasses and tell him not to be a bully. We're done. The lesson was complete. The case was closed. Judge Judy had not just ruled on a case. She had delivered a moral verdict, a lesson in accountability that was as old as time itself. The playground was a microcosm of the world, and bullying, whether it was with words or actions, had consequences. The applause was a testament to her moral authority, to her ability to see through the excuses and get to the heart of the matter. Okay, Marty Glenn's voice was small, defeated. She had come for justice and she had received a harsh lesson in fairness. Her son, the victim of a bully, was now the one who had to pay. Parties are excused, Bird, the bailiff, announced, his voice a final decisive note. You may step out. The courtroom began to stir. The show was over. The verdict had been delivered, and in the end, it wasn't just about the money. It was about the glasses, the hat, the bully, and the consequences. It was a lesson that the two boys and everyone in the courtroom would never forget.